Word of God, and it isn't a dead word.
How do I know the Scriptures is to be believed? Because Jesus Christ has told me so.
This is the Westminster Podcast. My name is Nate Shannon. I'm grateful to have Todd Rester here with me today, professor of church history here at Westminster. Church history, historical theology, what is it exactly?
Church history.
All things that happened before today. I don't know how up to what period. I know. Anyway, I'm glad you're here, Todd.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, for a very specific reason, actually. There are a lot of things we could talk about because you've taught centuries and centuries and centuries of church history here at Westminster, from the early church into the...
I have the privilege of teaching an ancient church survey.
Yeah.
I teach a medieval church survey for
Yeah.
MDiv and MAR students. And then I teach the Reformation class here. And then for the online modality, I've taught the ancient, medieval, and modern class. So I get the privilege of reading across a lot of different periods and seeing similar themes in church history about what Christian witness is, what the nature of holiness is, what is the kingdom of God, how did people in their period define and think about what it meant to be Christian and what the implications of that are, what the costs of it are, and what the joys of it are. There's a wonderful unity to that story, and yet in the different ages and periods and places, there's some very interesting context that drives some of those. Yeah,
fantastic. So over the course of your time here, you've had your fingers on vast sort of swaths of historical, the historical from the early up to the Reformation. So it's really exciting. We're not going to cover everything today, Tom.
Oh, sure, of course not.
So actually, we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
And so I thought, I'm not really interested in talking about bar crawls in South Philly, although that's geographically proximate. But what I'd like to talk about with you is Patrick of Ireland, Patrick himself, who is maybe the inspiration of celebrations from Chicago and New York to Philly and many other places around, global now, I suppose, but definitely in the English-speaking world. But many things are said about Patrick which aren't true. And actually, I think his story is so fascinating, so worthy of attention. And I think what we'll get to in the end, I'd love to hear you reflect finally on what you've just hinted at, which is really the value for the spiritual maturity, for the maturity of God's people, of thinking about somebody like Patrick. Mm-hmm. But let's get his story. Settled first. So he's a 5th century British-born. Became a
So he's born in Britain. What's the island of Britain? His father and family were squarely. I think you described it as middle class. There's a sense in which they owned a villa, which would have been like saying you owned a farm or an estate.
Probably on the west coast, right, of England, Scotland,
that's right.
Maybe Wales, something like that.
That's right. And so. He was born in the 5th century. His father was a priest in the town, and this we don't know where this town really is, but it was called Banavem Tabernii. And his father Calpurnius lived on a farm and in that estate. They were Roman in their nationality, they were Celtic in their culture, and they were Nicene Christian in their religion.
Give us a sense briefly of, if we're talking 5th century, we're way up on the northern outskirts of Europe.
Right.
What this is contemporary with Augustine.
Yes. So as far as we know, Patrick dies around 493 A.D.
Okay.
So he would have been born probably right about the time that Augustine is dying. Wow. And you're in a time of turmoil. The Roman Empire did not so much fall as much as collapse. It's constantly, ever since 180 AD, it's going through a massive number of leaders. In the 3rd century, for example, they went through something like 40 to 45 emperors within about 85 years.
Okay, not a sign of stability.
No, and the most common way for the transition of power to occur was somebody got assassinated.
Okay, also not a sign of stability.
Yeah, not a sign of stability. So the time leading into the 4th century, 3rd and 4th century is one of relative stability with Constantine and his heirs, but it's still falling apart. Rome is declining in its emphasis and its abilities and in its income. The economy is failing, and a lot of there's a lot of people groups moving around. It would look like John Madden football if I showed you all the different people groups moving from the eastern plains of Europe all the way down through the Iberian Peninsula and into northern Africa.
Wow.
So there's a tremendous number of people moving around. So he lives at a time when, there's Roman culture in Britain, there's Celtic culture right alongside of it. He's the son. He's a Christian. He's raised in a Christian home, and yet he's not terribly far from Druids and pagans and others in his context.
Yeah.
When Patrick is captured on a slave raid, his region was plundered, and he was captured and taken away into captivity, and ended up as a shepherd.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he has to learn the language, so
Yep.
he has to learn Gaelic as a slave. And he was captured probably when he was about 15 or 16 years old.
Do we know what language he would have spoken? He was learning Latin, right?
He does have places where, so he wrote his confessions in Latin.
Yeah.
He's embarrassed by his quality of Latin.
Okay.
He complains that he never got or laments, I should say, maybe not complain. Complain's not perhaps right, but he laments that he never had the opportunity to pursue a further education like other boys would have done if he would have not been captured. So basically he missed out on high school.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And while other kids were learning what it meant to be a Roman and being a statesman and this sort of thing, going to the rhetor schools and learning the poetry and all these other things, Patrick is on the side of an Irish hill tending sheep, learning slave Gaelic. And there's some fascinating comments in that space.
So one of the interesting things you've just mentioned is that we have writings from Patrick. So
and they've been translated. So you
yeah.
can find them. I mean, if any of our listeners wanted to look for this, you can find the Confession of Saint Patrick, and it's there's a 19th century edition of it. Comes out every so often, but it's a 19th century edition you can find, and it's pretty reliable. Yeah.
Okay. In addition to that, there's a lot of legend sort of surrounding Patrick, and maybe some of that legend is just because we're talking about a relatively early period, and it's hard to see from a modern historical point of view. It's hard to see with much clarity back so far. But also, he became kind of an object of religious veneration, which is its own catalyst for the generation of
there's
legendary accounts and so on.
In this period, there develops a genre in the early medieval period. So I'm thinking in terms of like 6th century through about the 11th century. Sometimes that's referred to as the Dark Ages.
Okay.
Most historians will qualify that term. If you mean the Dark Ages, what you really mean is not a place where there isn't culture and there isn't advanced learning and those things. The reason that historians might call it the Dark Ages today is because we don't know as much as we'd like. So it's dark.
So the darkness is ours.
The darkness is our obscurity, not because you don't have a rich cultural matrix there.
Wow.
There's an interesting study here as what does it mean to be a Roman, because that value is being co-opted by the Frankish Empire. You go to Aachen, Germany, in Charlemagne's court, and you have togaed Franks. They're wearing togas, and they have the laurel wreaths on their heads, and there's gold, and it's all sorts of Romanesque columns and other things that are going on in that architecture, but it's distinctively Carolingian. So there's always been a desire in the medieval period to take over what it meant to be Roman in culture, with that antiquity and those things. So when you say that Patrick was in a Roman Britain, that's an interesting point.
In the sense that maybe what it meant to be Roman was not so consistently communicated that far north in
That's
the
true.
empire.
Yeah, like if you have the opportunity to go through museums in Scotland and England, when you see grave markers from this period, you will find some very openly Christian sort of statements on the tombstones.
Okay.
In Latin, and And then in some contexts, you can see it on one side, they've got all of the pro forma Christian monikers and imagery on their graveside stone. Then you walk around to the other side, and there's inscriptions in Latin to some of the Roman gods.
Wow.
And to some of the pagan Gaelic gods.
Wow, just to have all those bases
so
covered.
some people are hedging their bets.
Yeah.
So the point to make is that, when you say Christian Roman Britain, that's an interesting statement. You've got people that are ardently and fervently what you might call Nicene Christian, and then there's other forms of Christianity there that could be more syncretistic.
Okay.
So it's an interesting time frame.
Yeah. In other words, it's not we don't want to oversimplify those sort of generalizations in that sense. So some legends regarding Patrick, that he used the shamrock to teach the Trinity, something like that.
He could have. That's possible.
It's not
but
impossible, right?
It's possible. But
you neither deny nor
well,
affirm nor deny. Yeah.
I don't think that's the most important element of it. Whether you wear green or orange on Patrick's Day is a very interesting other conversation. But one thing to note about the spiritualized and allegorical language of scorpions and snakes in this time frame.
So you're referring to the legend that Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland.
Yes.
Yeah. Which is not just a Rudyard Kipling story about why are there no snakes in Ireland. There's more to it, right?
Sure. So like if you went back to Athanasius, he wrote a life of St. Anthony, trying to inculcate a certain monastic piety among urban Alexandrians, Christians, that they're too worldly. He's giving them a life of St. Anthony, who lives in a cave and does battle with demons and lust and other sins and other vices. And some of the language that Anthony would use, according to Athanasius, had to do with snakes and scorpions, referring to these spiritual trials. So there's an interesting question. If this is a feature of the piety, then whenever you say Patrick drove out the snakes of Ireland, if there's an allegorical read on that, then you're dealing with Patrick trying to Christianize a pagan land.
Okay.
So, there's that.
Yeah. So there's potentially some substance to that.
So there's a nugget there somewhere.
Okay. Well, let me read something. Actually, I'm going to read from the very opening of Patrick's Confessions, and then ask you to give us some context. So it's really exciting to get to read this, written by Patrick himself in the 5th century. He starts out with this opening. My name is Patrick. I'm a sinner, a simple country person, and the least of all believers. I am looked down upon by many. My father was Calpurnius. He was a deacon. His father was Potatus, a priest, who lived at Benevum Tabernae. His home was near there, and that is where I was taken prisoner. I was about 16 at the time. At that time, I did not know the true God. I was taken into captivity in Ireland, along with thousands of others. We deserved this because we had gone away from God and did not keep his commandments. We would not listen to our priests who advised us about how we could be saved. The Lord brought his strong anger upon us and scattered us among many nations, even to the ends of the earth. It was among foreigners that it was seen how little I was. So give us some context, Dr.
Well,
Rester.
If you're thinking in terms of the Gaelic peoples, one of the things about tribal warfare is you don't go to Walmart, you raid your neighbors.
Okay. So availability of resources, they thought about it differently.
Yes, they did. That's a common motif in tribal warfare. It's about resource acquisition, and here it's about labor. It's about wealth and those things.
Okay.
But what you do see there is you see an early Christian commitment to the providence of God. He was not, Patrick came to this point. This is Patrick as an old man writing as a young man.
That's right. As Augustine's Confessions reflecting later.
So this is an old man reflecting on what the Lord was doing. This was not as it's happening.
It's not
Patrick,
a writing commentary.
No,
right?
It's not Patrick at 14 or 16. Thinking about I deserve this.
Yeah.
That's not where he's at.
Yeah.
So there's this wonderful, delightful point that I think he's reflecting about how the Lord is bringing people to Christ. at the end of his life. One thing to ponder here as an old man reflecting on his youth. One of the amazing stories that comes out of this is some historians estimate that Patrick probably baptized somewhere between 160 to 180,000 people in his lifetime.
Unbelievable. So
you can see immediately why someone, as it were, in the history books, would want Patrick on their team.
Yeah.
And that's why there's multiple lines of evidence on Patrick. You either read his resources on this, you read Patrick's primary sources, what he wrote, or you go 200 years later and read the lives of the saints, which have a certain formulaic genre to them. They need Patrick to do miracles. They need Patrick to walk with certain ecclesiastical ordinations. They need him to support certain bureaucratic framework within, in other words, reading lives of the saints are not such an easy thing. One of the things that we're doing in the life of a saint is not only implicitly talking about the church structures that are there, but you're also talking about certain patterns of holiness that involve a lot of contact with the holy. So the issue of relics, miracles. That's what you need to read. When you read the life of the saint, what's going on is someone is wanting, through this reading, they want Patrick's holiness.
Yeah.
And so some of these lives of the saints are actually like this kind of thing. If I can't go on pilgrimage to the place where someone did this actual thing, then at least by reading the life of the saint, in my heart, I can go on pilgrimage.
I've been there, or he's here with me. Or,
and I can go, well, maybe not he's here with me, but in my heart, I can go on this itinerant journey spiritually. Like, my heart is where that should. So so there's a really interesting point here about the piety. What does the life of the saint do when you're talking about Patrick? The goal is be like Patrick. Look at the way the grace of God worked in his life. If you want God to work through you like that, then you need to associate with this.
So I appreciate you saying that, because I think it would be standard to say, well, we have this historical personality, Patrick, and the first thing we want to do in our discussion is distinguish between truth and legend. Yeah. And there's a sense in which that's not historical.
That's not how they would have read it.
That's right. And so what you're describing actually is the piety of the people in the subsequent centuries, and how they would have thought of Patrick, and how they would have sort of venerated him, and even in a spiritual sense sort of sought some kind of encouragement from the person of Patrick. And so in that sense, to say, well, there's some details that aren't necessarily historical, that's important to recognize.
Sure.
At the same time,
That's right.
It does sort of truncate sort of a broader spiritual history in which we're actually interested. So we're not interested. We're not reconstructing the historical Patrick only.
Right.
We're interested in Patrick as an object of religious attention.
Patrick and the way he was read.
Patrick and the way he was read.
Yeah, one thing to remember in this conversation is there's two phrases that come up in Latin about monasticism in this period, at least in the Latin West. One is conversio, from which we get the English word conversion. Okay. And the other one is conversatio, which is where we get the English word conversation. And that one even shows up in the Westminster Standards, that let your conversation be. And what that means is it's more than just your speech. It's your manner of life. All right, so in the old Latin West, you had language about your conversion to God. For them, we think of in terms of like, when did you become a Christian? Right,
your moment. You're strangely warmed. Yeah.
They're thinking in terms of, when did I fully dedicate myself to the Lord by becoming a monk?
Oh, how about that?
So there's a Protestant moment where conversion. We still use the language of wholehearted devotion to God in the Western Latin tradition. But now it's not connected to a monastic piety in the same, like that way. Yeah. So the language of conversion there in Patrick, when did he finally devote himself totally to the Lord? There's a moment where you can say it's out on the hills. Yeah. When he's when he's crying out for mercy and wants to go home, and he's praying to the Lord. So there's this moment where what's going on in this 5th, 6th century time frame, conversion is when you fully dedicate yourself to the Lord by this pursuit of holiness within a community of monks.
Fascinating. I'm so tempted to reflect on that sort of systematic theologically, but I'm gonna steer clear of that, because we'll never come back. But so Patrick, he's living on the west coast of whatever might be Scotland or England, maybe even Wales, a group of raiders these are Irish raiders, and I don't know if can we say Irish? Is that the right term at this
Well,
point?
that's definitely the island.
Yeah. Okay.
You know,
All right.
we don't know the tribe, but we don't know because there's multiple kingdoms in Ireland.
Right. Okay.
If you were to study the history of it, and that would be a fascinating history. If you ever have a chance to go to Dublin, you should.
Okay.
There's a lot of Irish history and museums there that would reflect on all those ancient lands and the influence there. But so he's brought into Ireland and some distance from the coast because he reflects that it takes him. He has to go 200 miles on foot when he escapes.
Right. So he's traveling the length of the island. So he's chattel slavery. The guy is sold when he lands on the island, right?
Yes.
And then sort of finds himself at the lowest rung of of labor, right?
He describes himself as mostly naked in the clothes he's wearing. And I'll just tell you, having lived in Ireland, it's not that it's brutally cold. You're not going to it's not Norway. Right?
Yeah.
Scotland gets more snow than Ireland does typically, but it can get blustery and chilly. Like you can have strong winds and a lot of cold, misty air. It would be pretty miserable if you don't have the appropriate clothing. So anyway, all I'd say is that his experience was he was living a very basic subsistence life as a slave.
For how long is he living in the hills in these conditions? He's shepherding, right?
Yeah, and when he escapes, he says that he was awakened from a dream with a vivid understanding that his ship was ready.
Yeah, so this is fantastic.
And
he has a
and that was at about the age of 22.
Wow. Okay.
So
okay.
he was a slave for about 6 years.
7 years or so. Yeah.
He says that. He says that he reports in here that he crossed over about 200 miles on foot, and at first the captain of the ship didn't want to take him. There was a merchant, but then as Patrick left, kind of dejected and praying, he was suddenly invited on board. So he literally took his chance and hopped on board, and he says it took 3 days of sailing to get back.
So he's a runaway slave at this point.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what the captain of the ship was pondering because these are.
The liability of taking this guy on board, or
yes, Irish raiders are not exactly known for their
charity,
their gentility.
Yeah.
So anyway, he reports it was about 3 days of sailing, and then it took him about 28 days on foot to get home. Yeah.
Wow.
And there's a quote here that's really interesting. He says this after he comes home, he's starting to feel a sense of what we would call calling.
Right.
His parents, on the other hand, want him always home. I mean, he's been gone for 6 years, and now he's talking about leaving again. Just as a parent, you can imagine the heartbreak there. But they're probably just overjoyed to see him. And he reports this on the Calling the Ministry. He says this: "A few years later, I was again with my parents in Britain. They welcomed me as a son, and they pleaded to me that after all the many tribulations I had undergone, I should never leave them again." So he's pondering that. And he eventually finds his way to.
He has another dream. He has another vision at this point.
Yeah.
And he dreamed. This is so interesting. I was reading this, and I had sort of a mental blank as I was reading, and I came back in the story, and I couldn't. I didn't know whether it was true. It was, but a real historical counter vision. But I think he's asleep, and what he sees is a man comes to his family home, bringing letters, and he hands Patrick. This is his kind of vision/dream. He hands Patrick a letter, and Patrick breaks the seal, and it's sort of his Macedonian call. Yeah, he's saying, "Come to Ireland and help us." This is an untrained guy, whose experience in Ireland has not exactly been a setup for a glorious return.
No,
nobody would go back, right? And having lived in Ireland in that way.
It would definitely confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, that's
right. The Irish would be intrigued that he came back.
Yeah, that's right.
And the British would be horrified that he left.
His parents in particular, right?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So that's sort of his.
He certainly reports it that way. You know that he's got dreams. Dreams function for him in the 5th century. Yeah. He speaks in those ways. Yeah. But when after he comes back. Around the age of 22, he remained in Britannia for the next 12 years. And he was mentored by someone known as Germain of Auxerre.
Okay.
And that if that's his mentor, that places him in what is now northern Wales, near, and this is the name of the town, Mold.
Okay. Hey, man, you do you. You know
Well,
what I mean?
I'm not an expert in Welsh, so I can't speak to that. But even there, Patrick was troubled. He was troubled in his dreams that he's being called to return to Ireland, and in order to preach as missionary to the Irish and win them over from their paganism and unbelief. He initially says he refused and resisted that burden on his heart. And he says this, "I did not proceed to Ireland of my own accord until I was nearly worn out." So there's this, it wasn't something where he just immediately went, yes, of course.
So, yeah, I mean, does that speak to his character? Because, he grows up in a Christian household, we could say, and
Sure.
his father was a deacon and so on. But it takes 7 years living alone in the hills with the animals in Northern Ireland, lowercase n, somewhere in the north of Ireland.
Somewhere.
For him to sort of come to, and who knows when, I guess, exactly he
Well,
sort
he
of
wouldn't
comes
have had
to faith.
access to a calendar, right? I mean, he just knows that he reports over and over again how he prayed and cried.
How about that?
He prayed and cried as he's away from family and he's away from this, and he feels his dependence on God.
Yeah. And then now, he's sort of, is he training for ministry now in Wales?
I think
Is
that's as best as he could. He mentions that he didn't have the Latin education that he would have liked. He submitted to this inward call to the gospel ministry, and noting that God, he says it this way, equipped me so that I should care for and be busy about the salvation of others, whereas I then did not even think about myself. So there's this really, this would get you through a Presbytery faith and life exam, right? Why are you into ministry? And he goes, because I've gotten to the point where I'm thinking more about others than I am myself. And I can say that humbly. I can say that because that's the Lord has laid that's on my heart.
Interesting.
I am not going to know peace until I'm laboring for their salvation.
Wow.
So there's this, there's this really interesting moment. He and here's the other point too that I think that's important for the history of it. Patrick tells us that the church leadership in that region for where he was did not encourage him to go. They weren't fully on board or in favor of necessarily him going. And so, as far as I can read in the sources, the primary sources, he went on his own.
Not advisable.
No, but it's definitely it feels a lot more like a 19th century missionary, doesn't it? In some ways,
that's right. Yeah, fascinating. And he says he was called to the ends of the earth. Of course, it was just a short. You could take a ferry now in a couple of hours, I suppose. But
from the perspective of Roman Britain, it is the ends of civilization.
Yeah, how about that? So 6 or 7 years as a shepherd, he sort of escapes following a vision that he has, even a specific vision that says, your ship is ready. So he treks on foot 200 miles across Ireland, ends up on a ship, crosses back to Britain.
Spends about 12 years in a mentor relationship. So he's in his mid-30s.
Okay, so he's kind of training potentially. And do we know whether
He's definitely being trained in certain patterns of piety, of prayer, of Bible reading.
Okay.
One of the things you have to realize about monasticism in this 5th century, 6th century time, they are reading the Psalms and memorizing them. They're reading that. And if you're an Augustinian, and it's too soon perhaps to talk about an Augustinian order, but by the time you get to the later Middle Ages, still in the early Middle Ages, but definitely later than this, they're not only reading the scriptures at meals and throughout the day, but they're also reading, their various monastic rules, their various understandings of they would read Augustine's Confessions. Even the format of Patrick writing a confession is an interesting point.
Okay.
There's a line. I want to read this section to you because it's from Patrick's own discussion of God's lordship in his life. He says it this way: "It was not any grace in me, but God who overcame in me, I came to the heathen Irish to preach the gospel and to endure insults from unbelievers, so as to hear the reproach of my going abroad and endure many persecutions, even to bondage, that I should give up my freedom for the profit of others. And if I should be worthy, I am ready to give even my life for God's name's sake, unhesitatingly and very gladly. And there in Ireland I desire to spend my life, even to the point of death, if the Lord would grant it to me. So
It's a clear call
yeah,
to missions.
yeah, that's right.
To the very land of, I mean, he's returning to the land of his
And
literal enslavement.
And his own understanding of God's grace, it reshaped and reformed how he saw his life. I mean, he says this, because I'm a debtor exceedingly to God, who granted me such great grace, that many peoples through me should be regenerated to God and afterwards confirmed, and that clergy should everywhere be ordained for them for a people newly come to believe, which the Lord took from the ends of the earth, as he had in times past promised through his prophets. So he's reading the scriptures, the prophets, and he's reading the New Testament, and he's directly connecting what he's doing to, well, what we would call the Great Commission and to the book of Acts. You know, this is exactly what the Lord promised he would do.
Yeah, it's interesting, the so holistic character of his ministry, from what you just read. He's going to evangelize.
Yeah.
He travels around preaching the gospel. But he's also interested in establishing the church. So he's interested in sort of formalizing the religion. He baptizes thousands upon thousands. I read an interesting account of baptism at the time. It was not uncommon for the baptizee to be stripped naked as a sign of new birth.
Yep.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that kind of reframes the question of why you might want a deaconess.
A number of complexities.
Well,
I think.
so to the point though about the baptismal font, if you go to like say Ravenna, Italy, and you look in the same time frame from the 4th, 5th centuries, by the time you get into there was a time in Ravenna, Italy, where the king that ruled over Italy was not Roman. He's some version of an Ostrogothic chieftain. And the challenging point there is that the Ostrogoths were typically Arians, and the Romans were typically Nicene, and you actually have, well, rival chapels, rival churches, buildings, and they have rival baptistries. And both of them, you know, it's not going to give comfort to any modern denomination. They had like a baptistry that goes up to your kneecap.
Okay.
And it's probably the width of this table.
Wow.
And then somebody's standing on a platform pouring buckets or pots and jars full of water over you.
Huh.
So
it's neither one nor the other in terms of the...
It's kind of a blend, isn't it? You know, you've got a splash pool, and you've got you know, gallons, like, you know, Home Depot 5-gallon buckets worth that are being dumped.
It's not a sprinkling, however.
But it's not exact. I mean, you are drenched. You know, like you are
drenched but not immersed. Or very interesting.
You might feel like you're being drowned. I don't know, but
interesting. Okay.
So there's interesting points here about the language of this. You know, what exactly is the rite of baptism in this period? Well, for catechumens coming out of paganism, that's certainly the form. You know, you go through a long period of catechizing, like up to a decade in some cases, before you're baptized.
Wow, interesting. Let me read this, and I'll ask you to comment on the. This is I think paragraph 4 from the Confessions. He says, "This is because there is no other God, nor will there ever be, nor was there ever, except God the Father. He is the one who was not begotten, the one without a beginning, the one from whom all beginnings come, the one who holds all things in being. This is our teaching, and his Son, Jesus Christ, whom we testify, has always been, since before the beginning of this age, with the Father in a spiritual way. He was begotten in an indescribable way before the beginning, or before every beginning. Everything we can see, and everything beyond our sight, was made through him. He became a human being, and having overcome death, was welcomed to the heavens, to the Father. or by the Father. The Father gave him all power over every being, both heavenly and earthly and beneath the earth. Let every tongue confess that Jesus Christ, in whom we believe, and whom we await to come back to return to us in the near future, is Lord and God. He is judge of the living and of the dead. He rewards every person according to their deeds. He has generously poured on us the Holy Spirit, the gift and promise of immortality, who makes believers and those who listen to be children of God and co-heirs with Christ. This is the one we acknowledge and adore, one God in a trinity of the sacred name. It's fantastic stuff, Todd.
This is, if you ask me what was he doing for 12 years in an abbey, this is it. There's Nicene orthodoxy all the way through this. He's very well apprised of the debates and issues that are going on. And I think it happens because he's in this context of that abbey, Germain of Auxerre.
Yeah.
So it shows you somebody that you see the fervent faith, you see the simple belief, you see the eager willingness, and you also see that didn't mean he went off without some training.
Right. That's right. No, this is robust Nicene Trinitarianism.
That's right.
His Christology is unflinchingly.
That's right.
Yeah, very high Christology, and this little statement again from his Confessions follows very clearly a Trinitarian pattern. It looks like the Apostles' Creed, all the elements. So it's
not bad for the late 5th century, right?
Fantastic, really,
Yeah.
just amazing. And he's in a context. This is not a modern secular context. This is a how would I put it? I mean, it's
a pious pagan context.
It's an Athens.
Yeah.
You're very religious in everything, in every possible way, in every aspect of your culture. They're polytheistic. They have all kinds of strange and disturbing rituals.
Yeah, it would definitely be some sort of animism.
Yeah.
There's a deep sense of holy spaces in the pagan understanding of things. You've got holy groves and trees, and it's very much a holiness rooted in place. And you have to understand, like, as some of the things that develop in the 4th, 5th, 6th century, can you imagine just for a minute, can you imagine, like, if you were dealing with pagan neighbors like this, and you came through one day singing a hymn or singing a psalm, and they began to shout at you, you are denigrating and breaking the power of our gods. I think you're going to come back with 5 of your friends, and you guys are going to have a prayer march. Wait a second.
Yeah.
When we show up and sing Christian hymns, it drives away your gods? That's what you think?
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I think we're getting ready to lead a
We
group
have
of
something to talk about. Yeah.
We're going to lead a group of seminarians singing loudly. It's gonna. You're going to get the. What
We're
could
called
be
to arms. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an interesting element here to think about whenever you have monks going out on a peripatetic. We're going out, like it says in the Gospels, to go out and do ministry. We're not going to take a bag. We're not going to take anything with us. We're just going to go. Well, there's also this element of they're going out. As they're going, they're singing and praying and walking. Yeah. And they do understand themselves as in spiritually enemy territory.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a vibe to that of they understand themselves as operating in a very pagan, very demonic context. Yeah. And it's only going to be through preaching and through praise and prayer that this is going to change.
So it's fascinating that he would have this kind of, if I could say, Christ-like or gospel affection for the land and the people where he was enslaved, and he's willing to die there. He wants to give his life for the gospel in Ireland. So he preaches and he baptizes for something like 3 decades.
Yes.
Yeah. And has a massive influence.
And it wasn't smooth sailing. If you read the accounts of it, there's times where he was almost killed several times. One of the things that he talks about, one of the things that saved his life actually was the way in which he held his property in light regard. Anything that people tried to give to him, he gave it away. And that actually saved his life among some of these chieftains. he says it this way: I used to give presents to the kings, but nevertheless they seized me with their companions, and on that day they most eagerly desired to kill me. But my time had not yet come, and everything they found with us they plundered, and me myself they bound with irons. And on the 14th day the Lord delivered me from their power. It doesn't tell us exactly why.
Wow.
But you cannot go into ministry like this with a tight grip on your possessions. And by the time you get to like the rule of Columbanus, these are some of the disciples of Patrick and others. By the time you get to the rule of Columbanus, and some of the sermons that we have that are written down from this.
What do you mean by rule in that statement?
It's the rule of Columbanus is like a monastic rule. It's
right.
like
so not a reign.
No, it's more like a
practice.
Think of it
discipline.
think of it like monastic bylaws.
Okay.
Like this is the terms of our terms of living here and dwelling among us.
Okay.
But one of the things you get out of Columbanus and some of the other preachers in this period is they would say the only thing you truly possess is your own soul. Huh. Why would you trade anything else for your own soul? And then they launch into quoting the Gospels. You know, what does it profit you to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Well, in this case, when you're in a pagan environment where they're tribal raiders, they prize money, they prize slaves as a sign of force and power, and they prize armies or war bands. Somebody that shows up with a light grip on their own possessions, willing to be debased and poor among them, they're not viewed as a threat, but they're extraordinarily subversive. Like, they're going to show and live out a different life.
Yeah, that's a 1 Peter 3. Why are you living this way?
Yeah.
I mean, it's countercultural.
Well, it is. I mean, and if you read, there's a parallel here between some of the experience of the 19th century missionaries that would go and live in foreign lands. They would have to be, you'd have to be committed to living among the people, eating their food, dressing like them, taking on their lifestyle, and willing to be debased to be in that. And in that you have something that I think is characteristically Christian. It's cross-like.
Tell us more about that. What do you mean by that?
Well, Philippians 2, have this mind which was also in Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. And that's not just like if you're in modern America, that's generally people thinking about their reputation.
And their retirement account.
And yes, it's all of that. Here it's don't think of yourself as, Paul used to introduce himself as a doulos, right?
Yeah.
There's something to that.
Yeah.
Paul would introduce himself according to the least name of the Greco-Roman caste system. And the word Paulos just means little one, least one. So there's something in this Christian character, this apostolic diminishment, where the choice of Christ for the sake of others at great expense, it starts with, have you let go of these things first with God? And that's what we saw Patrick wrestle with, So what I see in Patrick is there's a common theme here that you can find. One of the things I loved doing by teaching through ancient and medieval and Reformation and even modern classes is I like introducing students to Christians they didn't expect to find.
Okay.
Like I wasn't prepared to meet somebody like Patrick when I read today for medieval, or read today for the ancient church class, and I think that's a really helpful point that the Word of God has changed hearts and lives, and we shouldn't be surprised when we find people in the past.
Yeah.
And when you think through what Patrick says as an old man, just listen to this. This is an extended quote, but I think it's a helpful one.
Yeah.
This is out of chapter 38. He says this: I am greatly in debt to God. He gave me such great grace that through me many people should be born again in God and brought to full life. And I read part of this earlier, but here it is again. Also that clerics should be ordained everywhere for the people who have lately come to believe and who the Lord has taken from the ends of the earth. This is just what he promised in the past through his prophet. The nations will come to you from the ends of the earth, and they will say, how false are the idols our fathers got for themselves, and they are of no use whatsoever. And again, I have put you as a light to the nations, that you may be their salvation to the end of the earth. He goes on, and he says this. I see that already in the present age the Lord has given me a greatness more than could be expected. I was not worthy of this, not the kind of person the Lord would do this for, since I know for certain that poverty and calamity are more my style than riches and enjoyment. But Christ the Lord became poor for us. I too am wretched and unhappy. Even if I were to wish for riches, I do not have them. I am not trying to judge myself, since every day there is the chance that I will be killed, or surrounded, or be taken into slavery, or some other such happening. But I fear none of these things. Because of the promises of heaven, I have cast myself into the hands of Almighty God, who is the ruler of all places. As the prophet says, cast your concerns on God, and he will sustain you. Now I commend my soul to my most faithful God. For him I perform the work of an ambassador, despite my less than noble condition. However, God is not influenced by such personal situations, and he chose me for this task so that I would be one servant of his very least important servants. So, 120 to 180,000 people baptized in his ministry. There's a simplicity here. There's a humility here. And there's a genuine gospel drive here.
Yeah. Fantastic stuff. Let me read just a little bit more, and we'll bring it to a close. So here is almost to the conclusion of his confessions. Patrick writes, the sun, which we see rising for us each day at his command, that sun will never reign, nor will its splendor continue forever, and all those who adore that sun will come to a bad, miserable penalty. It's very contextual, right? We, however, believe in and adore the true Son, that is, Christ, who will never perish. Nor will they perish who do his will, but they will abide forever, just as Christ will abide forever. He lives with God the Father Almighty and with the Holy Spirit before the ages began, and now, and for all the ages of the ages. Amen. This is Patrick of Ireland. Thank you so much, Todd.
This is fun.
This is the Westminster Podcast.
This has been a podcast of Westminster Media. Westminster Media is a ministry of Westminster Theological Seminary. If you would like to join us in our mission to train specialists in the Bible to proclaim the whole counsel of God for Christ and his global church, please visit www.wts.edu/donate. This podcast was hosted by Nate Shannon and edited by Brandon McLean Smith.